Good morning, everyone. I'm Eric Langenbacher, the Senior Fellow and the Director of the Society, Culture, and Politics program at the American German Institute. And I'm really pleased to be part of this webinar today, which is entitled, "Is Far-Right Violence a Threat to the West?" With our current fellow, Josefin Graef. But we also have Hans Kundnani here, who will be moderating today's webinar. Hans is an old friend and currently an associate fellow at Chatham House, where he ran the Europe program for some time. Next year, he's actually going to be a visiting scholar at the Remark Institute at NYU. And he's also the author of a recent book, which is causing quite a buzz, I must say. It's called Euro-Whiteness, Culture, Empire, and Race in the European Project. So without further ado, I will hand the baton to Hans, who will take it from here. Hans.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thanks for that introduction. I'm really excited to be moderating this webinar as well, in which Josie is going to be presenting the work that she's been doing since June, since she's been a fellow at the American German Institute in DC. So before we get going, so the way this is going to work is that Josie is going to present for, I think, about 25-30 minutes, and then we'll have some discussion. If you want to ask a question, can you do that by writing in the Q&A box, not in the chat box? We're going to keep the chat box for sort of side conversations if you want to just discuss things. But I'm just going to be looking at the Q&A box. So if you want me to read out or ask one of your questions, then do write it in there. And the shorter you can keep it, the better, because then it's more easier for me to read it while I'm trying to follow the discussion. So I think this is going to be really, really interesting because I feel like there's a lot of discussions right now about the far right for obvious reasons. But this one I think is a little bit different because it's linking the far right with two things which are not normally discussed together with the far right, i.e. the concept of the West and the work of Reinhold Niebuhr. I can't think of many times I've actually been in discussions even linking the far right and the West, let alone also bringing in Niebuhr in such an interesting way as Josie does. And I think by doing that, it raises all kinds of really interesting questions, big questions, actually, not just about the far right and how to deal with the far right, but about international politics, I think, about some of the big issues in international politics. So I think we're going to get into some of that in the discussion after Josie is finished presenting. But first of all, over to you, Josie.
Thanks, Hans. Welcome to this webinar. Thanks for joining this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you to the American German Institute for hosting me these past few months since June and really providing the perfect environment to do my research. I just want to share my screen presentation for today. There we go. Can everybody see that? Yeah, great. Okay. So what I want to talk to you today about is how we can conceive of far-right violence as a threat to liberal democracy beyond the nation state, and in particular, how that relates to ideas of the West, as Hans was just mentioning. There are kind of two parts to my talk. I will first talk about how the Munich Security Conference back in 2020 actually put far-right violence front and center in its diagnosis of the West's identity crisis, what they termed Westlessness. And I also say something about the empirical evidence that we have about how the violent far right itself has begun to integrate ideas of the West into their repertoire. And then the second part, I will talk about what an ethical response to these new narrative driving far right violence may look like. And in particular, I will argue that the Christian realist thinking of Reinhold Niebuhr a name that will be familiar to many of those on the call, in particular to those based in DC, how his thinking is helpful to develop such an ethical response. And then at the very end, I'll also say something about how we're seeing on the national level, specifically in the US and Germany, early signs of such a response emerging, and the way perhaps in which we can scale this up to the international level. So let's start with the Munich Security Conference and their diagnosis of Westlessness. It's useful to start with the Munich Security Conference, I find, because it is, of course, the leading forum for debating international security, established 60 years ago within the context of the Cold War, originally as a NATO forum, and today, of course, it is also co-funded by the German Foreign Ministry. So it is a good starting point for analyzing new developments in perceptions of security, including, and this is very helpful, on a more conceptual level, and also in relation to security broadly conceived. So in early 2020, the sixth edition of the Munich Security Report, which has been published since 2015, each year ahead of the Munich Security Conference, responded to perceptions that the West was in decline. And those perceptions had emerged around the Munich Security Conference the year before, in 2019, when divisions between the US and Europe in particular were becoming really apparent under the Trump presidency. And so this concept and diagnosis of Westlessness was a response to these perceptions. So the report offered this concept of Westlessness, and to summarize the diagnosis that they offered, what they said was that not only was the West or the world becoming, as it says here in this quote, becoming less Western as a whole, it was also the West itself that was becoming less Western, i.e. less democratic, less liberal, both within countries in the West, geographic West, so still mainly referring really to Canada, the US, and the European Union, and also across these countries. And the report made clear that what was at the verge of being lost was an idea of a good, a civic West. And they explicitly contrasted that with ideas of Western decline or the death of the West, that we find in the books of specifically they mention Oswald Spengler, of course, the decline of the West, Der Untergang des Abendlandes, in the original German, which was published right at the end of the First World War and then the second volume in 1922. That's important to emphasize, right? So the report really distinguishes quite clearly between the civic good West and the civilizationalist idea of the West. It was, they said, nothing short of an identity crisis that the West was facing. The West as a normative project, and by implication also a crisis for the liberal international order, quote unquote, that the West stands for and promotes. And even more importantly, perhaps the crisis, this identity crisis of the West, had negative consequences for the world as a whole, because the assumption, of course, is that without a sense of unity and purpose, Western countries were unable to take on responsibility in the world. And they identified two key reasons for that identity crisis. So on the one hand, of course, external challenges, in other words, great power competition and the rifts that that has caused within the transatlantic relationship, especially over Russia and China. And of course, we all know that things have gotten even more complicated in that area since. But my focus is on the other reason that was diagnosed in the report, the other reason for Westlessness, which are internal challenges. I quote you from the report. It said the contemporary spiritual disunity of the West, and here they're actually quoting Tom McTague, who wrote about this in The Atlantic following the NATO summit in London in December 2019, so just a few weeks before the report was published. It says that this disunity is due to the rise of an illiberal and nationalist camp within the Western world. And then it went on, proponents of this close interpretation that is associated with that camp believe that the white Christian West today is threatened by outsiders with different religious beliefs or cultural backgrounds. And this is from the introduction of the report, which conceptualizes Westlessness. So in other words, there's this direct competition between different ideas of the West, the liberal, closed nationalists on the one hand, and liberal and open for cooperation, multilateralism, open societies, diverse societies on the other hand. And importantly, this civilizationist ideas of the West was essentially about whiteness and Christianity. And then I'll come back to that. Based on this diagnosis, and that's the even more interesting part, really, it said something about far-right violence specifically. I quote, in its most extreme variant, this stream of thinking about the West has led white nationalists to attack synagogues and mosques in the West, or to kill citizens and politicians with different political beliefs. For sure, only a small minority is willing to use violence to defend its understanding of the West, but more moderate variations of the stream of thinking are represented in most Western political systems these days. In other words, illiberal nationalism was also a security threat in a narrower sense, because these ideas inspire violent acts nurtured by nurturing fears of demographic and social change. Now, the empirical research on that connection between far-right actors, far-right parties, and far-right violence is really in its infancy. Colleagues are working on creating, a clearer picture here. There is evidence to suggest that there is a close connection between the two. Not necessarily only in one direction, as in more far-right parties create more far-right violence. On the contrary, there's evidence that shows that the opposite is the case. That far-right parties do actually reduce the overall number of attacks. But of course, there are other things that particular forms of violence that might not be covered by this research. There's also other forms of hate crime, etc. So it's early days, too early really to say. We can come back to that during discussion. But I think for the Munich Security Report, what is important to point out is that these ideas, white nationalist ideas, and the violence that they inspire are a perversion, essentially, of the West as it should be, right? Because these civilizationist ideas of the West exclude, even kill non-white, non-Christian people and attack their institutions. So in other words, those who are different from, which is in itself interesting way of putting it. But you would also find that in scholarly research, actually. But there's more in the report, because it kind of spells out this threat from far-right violence and the far-right more broadly in a two-page special section. So I mean, the Munich Security Report has those different sections on themes and particular threats that they describe in a kind of succinct way. And in this year, in 2020, they had a section which had this interesting title, Right-Wing Extremism, White and Wrong, where they kind of spell out this threat from right-wing extremist violence as a non-traditional security threat. And it says, building on the introduction to that report, while its adherents are highly heterogeneous, right-wing extremism commonly refers to the act of supporting or committing violence based on the belief in one's racial, ethnic, or cultural supremacy, fierce nationalism, and or opposition to government authority. That's an interesting way of defining it. It's important perhaps to say that they take this, take their inspiration in a way for defining right-wing extremism that way from START, which is the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism Center at the University of Maryland, which is supported by the US Department of Homeland Security. And that explains why they define right-wing extremism specifically in relation to violence, because the START document that is referenced here actually talks about the different extremist ideologies that motivate terrorism as a specific type of ideologically motivated violence. So according to START, that would then be, violence that is illegal, perpetrated by sub-state groups, that is purposeful, has a political purpose, and tries to achieve that by, creating some kind of psychological effect in the population. The definitions that we find in the academic literature are quite different. So they would usually define right-wing extremism as a combination of other kinds of isms, in particular authoritarianism and nativism, and some form of exclusion, xenophobia, racism. So there's no, consensus definition in the literature either, but distinction would be made between violent and non-violent forms of right-wing extremism, even though the ideology tends to be characterized itself as inherently violent, right? That element is always attached to the basic idea. There are different typologies as well, distinguishing between premeditated strategic violence, what the report itself actually does refer to as right-wing terrorism, and more spontaneous acts, which all fall under this, kind of broad category of right-wing extremist violence. I think the interesting thing to point out here is that this connection between white and wrong in the section title is, really, really telling in a way, because it implies that racial, ethnic, cultural supremacy, nationalism, anti-government violence in the West all have something to do with white supremacy. And that this is, and that's the key point, in direct opposition to a liberal democratic order. I will continue referring to far-right violence in the talk simply because it is the broadest term possible to refer to political violence that is rooted in ideas of fundamental human inequality, and it also avoids isms for the time being, which tend to reinforce the strict binary between white supremacy and liberal democratic order. Okay, apart from definition then, the section also provides some data on far-right, in their terminology, right-wing extremist attacks and fatalities in Western countries. So again, mostly, well, really exclusively in this case, referring to the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Western Europe, so not even covering the entire European Union. It highlights a few, major attacks that we've all, of course, heard about, kind of starting in a way with Anders Behring Breivik's attacks on the 22nd July 2011. That is a key event, not only because, as you can see here, it was this high number of fatalities, 77 people, most of them, in their teens and 20s, of course, the mass shooting in Utøya. And the data actually that you see here, a lot of that is based on research being done at the Research on Extremism, CREX at the University of Oslo, which is, itself a product, kind of, almost founded in the wake of those attacks, in order to get a better idea of just how much, right-wing extremist violence is actually happening, especially in Western Europe. But apart from this, and the shootings in Christchurch in New Zealand, attack on 2 mosques in El Paso at a supermarket, and Pittsburgh on a synagogue. There are lots of other attacks that we could mention. Interestingly enough, Germany is actually not mentioned in the report, but of course, they could have, talked about the serial killings by the National Socialist Underground until 2007. They could have talked about the attack on the synagogue in Halle in October 2019. And then, of course, later we also, in 2020, just after the security conference was finished, there was this major attack in Hanau as well. On statistical data, again, this is a very recent development in itself, right? So systematic data collection is fairly recent and comes, with its own set of issues. And as I said, is in many ways a response to these very high level attacks in a way that we've seen across countries in the geographic West. And the attacks mentioned here, of course, also already pointed to the main target groups of those attacks, who are, ethnic and religious minorities. So in particular, Muslims, Jews, Black population in the US, and, their institutions, so synagogues, mosques, churches, and also, spaces of socialization, as well as individual politicians like Lübke, for example, in June 2019, was killed by a neo-Nazi, and also attacks on political institutions, like on January 6th. It is important to point out that although we've begun to kind of create this started to map far-right violence across the West, each and every one of those attacks is still nationally specific in many ways, right? In terms of ideology, in terms of who is attacked, it depends a lot on the demographics. It depends on political geography. Very important, for example, and in the case of Breivik. So that's important to remember, right? If we talk about far-right violence, but beyond the national context, there are elements that are very specific to national contexts. At the same time, of course, far-right violence since the end of the Second World War does have a long history in Western liberal democracies, and that includes transnational aspects, so the ways in which groups and movements inspire each other and learn from each other. Again, scholars have just begun really to explore this history in a systematic fashion. There's really interesting work, for example, being done by Michelle and Khan at the University of Virginia, I believe. But it is that history is very, very important to research because it is very much the basis for what we're seeing right now. But again, very early days. Also, it's important to point out, and you can see that here, already there is no consistent upward trend when it comes to far-right violent attacks and also fatalities that they cause over the past 10 years or so, since 2011, again, key year. And there's also no linear, development across Western countries. Having said that, those attacks go hand in hand with changes in networking, with changes in communication, especially online. There are a lot of colleagues working on, mapping those networks and their interactions. We see more lone perpetrators acting violently, more loosely organized perpetrators as well. So it's not the kind of, violent subcultures that we saw a lot in the 1990s. Or military movements, especially in the US. So things have changed there, right, as well. So overall, we do see a new kind of threat environment and also different threat perception. And that is covered actually by the Munich Security Conference itself in this new Munich Security Index that they've created. And they first published in 2021, where they study perception of security threats in the G7 and BRICS countries. And I've just listed here that the 6 countries from Europe and North America that are included in the study. And right-wing terrorism, again, terminology is complicated, but that is the one that they go with in the report. We can see, first of all, that Germany has the kind of scores highest here. This is an aggregate across different scores for risk and severity and likelihood on a scale from 1 to 100. But yeah, Germany scores here in the 50s range. In the US, and of course, this is only data for like 3 years, right? So we'll see what will happen next year and beyond when they ask this question again. But you can see, upward trajectory in the US, same with Canada, and that very much corresponds with, major attacks, right? Especially when it comes to right-wing terrorism, the attention is very much guided by individual events, which is, for example, very different from compared to Islamist terrorism. And in particular, what has changed and what has created this new way of talking about this threat is an increasingly connected far-right milieu around narratives of Western supremacy. The Munich Security Report 2020 touches on that, but there is more to say. But I do think that they're correct in their diagnosis that we can talk about a westernization of far-right violence. So what that means essentially is that the far right, or at least parts of the far right, make explicit and strategic use of the dominant connotations of the concept of the West. Democracy and order and civic rights on the one hand, and whiteness and Christianity on the other hand, Judeo-Christian culture, the Occident, das Abendland. All of these ideas are there, and of course the connection that they draw between these things is a causal one, right? We have democracy and rights and believe in progress, etc., because we're a white Christian culture. And I think it's very important to point out that this combination basically of these different connotations of the West has an immense emotional appeal, right? Because they managed to organize these ideas around ideas of loss, of deservingness, who gets what, essentially, and of course in particular to ideas of betrayal, right? AKA great replacement theory. We have to save Western culture from those other Westerners who want to, Western elites who want to destroy it. And even more importantly, and again, academia, scholars have just started to pick up on that, they connect these civilizationalist ideas and ideas of defense of the West to broader security issues, including war, health, climate, migration, right? So it's not like a niche anymore. It kind of really connects to all these different policy issues and makes it much more visible. And just to give you a couple of examples, because yeah, there's a broad pool to choose from. So famously, of course, Anders Breivik was talking about exactly that in his compendium. That's really what it is, more than a manifesto. That title 2083 is about the second defeat of Islam after the Battle of Vienna in 1683, right? So there are dozens of mentions in that compendium. I mean, it's 1,500 pages, right? But dozens of mentions of Western civilization specifically, and hundreds of times it talks about civilization. So it's very, very dominant. But similarly, in a group that is very different in a way from Breivik, in the US, we have the very same ideas. The Proud Boys were founded on this idea. Here's Gavin McInnes, the founder of Proud Boys, in 2016, right? So we're ultimately talking about very recent developments. Where he said, when he announced the founding of the group, that Western chauvinists who refused to apologize for creating the modern world, that is the Proud Boys. Our forefathers died in battle to protect our freedoms. The least we can do is be inconvenienced, right? And there's no anonymity and pride, and that's very, very important, right? There is this. It's very much out there. right? It's not a violent subculture anymore. It is about, being, proud of being white and Christian. I mean, already back in 2003. So 13 years before he actually founded that group, and he had founded Vice Media back in 1994 when he was in his mid-20s. But already then he was talking about these ideas, right? That he he loved being white, and that was something to be proud of. And then over the course of 1.5 decades, that kind of translated into the Proud Boys, and as we all know, they played a major role in the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. But we would find these kind of references across manifestos, Christchurch, or the perpetrator in Halle in Germany in October 2019, who tried to attack that synagogue. There are countless cross references between these perpetrators and the groups that they're associated with. Of course, McGuinness famously has tried to distance the Proud Boys from violence, and also kind of stepped down in a way in 2018 and was not actually present in Charlottesville in 2017, etc. Because he wanted to keep up this idea of being proud of being white and Christian as a legitimate and moral way of thinking about the West. So as I said, the report kind of really diagnoses that in a useful way. But what is missing from the report is an idea of how Western liberal democracies can respond to these narratives. These narratives that promote, in their terminology, a wrong idea of the West, right? And I think that the answer to that question in many ways lies in the report itself. Except that its conception of the good West is incomplete, at the very least. There we go. Okay, so we move on to that big question of how to respond. The best illustration, I think, of the report's incomplete conception of the West is that it references, interestingly enough, a statement by Javier Ortega Smith, the former Secretary General of Vox, a leading far-right party in Spain, where he said that Islamic invasion threatens Western civilization, including Europe, liberty, progress, democracy, etc. And they use that quote from him to illustrate this idea of what they call the wrong idea of the West. Now, the statement itself was taken from a piece that appeared in Open Democracy in 2019 by Luis Dean Valencia Garcia, who's a history professor at Texas State University. But what they do not mention is the title of that piece in Open Democracy, which was The Ups and Downs and Clashes of Western Civilization, and the fact that Valencia Garcia's entire argument in that piece, and he starts with a quote from Ortega Smith, is precisely that responding to this kind of civilizationist narrative of the West, that it requires a more critical view of Western history and culture itself, because, and that is the key point, they are a product of Western thinking, to the extent that they combine these virtues and vices of the West, if you like. So rationality, progress, democracy, rights, etc. on the one hand, and then Christianity and white supremacy on the other hand. So he says in that piece, and again, the report fails to mention this, historically, being Western or civilized was a powerful weapon used to legitimate the domination of others who were outside Europe. The promise of Western civilization became an excuse to dominate, to civilize others. Now, he's of course not the only one who's made this call for a more critical approach to the West along those lines, and in light of a growing violent far right. You can read Hans' new book, if you like, that makes a related argument about the role of whiteness in the European project that is just as relevant to this point. But I think, generally speaking, the point to say is that it's not enough to simply declare civilizationist ideas of the West to be wrong, because it doesn't make them go away and it doesn't make them any less appealing, both to the mainstream and to the fringes, as it were. And this uncritical idea of a good West is particularly problematic when it comes to far-right violence, because preventing forms of supremacist violence, of course, is very much at the heart of the West as a normative project since the Second World War. And that is precisely why large parts of the far right actually condemn far-right violence, because they know just how useful that is to keep up an idea of morality, right? They understand the ethical importance of condemning this violence, but then also, of course, use it to dog whittle essentially at constitutional rights of self-defense, right? This is wrong, but like Trump has done, of course, or accuse others, political competitors, of being undemocratic themselves because they blame this violence on those parties. That's what the AfD in Germany has done. But instead, instead of like being more reflective of these things, what we find in the report is this idea of the West as flawed but essentially good, right? A very ahistorical idea of the West. It has its flaws, but it's not evil itself. So it says at the very end of the introduction on Westlessness, Western liberal democracies are far from perfect. A revitalization of the West in the world must start at home, but in contrast to autocratic regimes, liberal democracies have built-in mechanisms that allow for course corrections and democratic renewal. There may be bugs in the system, but it's not the system itself that is the bug. So the question remains how we can develop a more radically critical view of the West without, however, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as it were, by denying its virtues and historical achievements. In other words, those things that we do feel like are worth defending. And that's where Reinhold Niebuhr comes in. So there's the second, shorter part as well.
Just a heads up, Josie, that we're about 35 minutes in. So okay, you might want to, and I think we're only on slide 8. But
yeah, that's fine. So really 5 minutes would be enough to make this point. I mean, so Reinhold Niebuhr, again, probably familiar to a lot of people on the call, born in 1892, first generation American, German-American, so also spoke German, read German, which is why he knew Germany very well. Protestant pastor in Detroit for 13 years before he became professor of Christian ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York, where he spent most of his life. And just to briefly summarize what his Christian realism, which is of course the term that he's most associated with, is all about. So first, essentially, as humans, we have the capacity, but also an ethical responsibility, because we're creatures of God, to work towards a more just world. We will never quite achieve paradise in a way, but working towards it is important. At the same time, our human condition puts limits on doing exactly that, because on the one hand, we can use our freedoms that God gives us. I mean, he's a theologian, right? To do good in the world and transcend ourselves and all of these things that the Munich Security Conference also emphasizes. But we also often overestimate what we can do, consciously or unconsciously. We overestimate our capacities and essentially kind of try to take the place of God, which means to fall into sin. And for Niebuhr, this is not just a theory, right? This plays out in politics on an everyday level. And importantly, when we talk about far right violence beyond, national level, at the national level as well, but especially beyond that, there's this dialectic that he describes between capacities and limits, transcendence, sin, that drives history and politics is particularly pronounced in international politics, because nations and world community, all kinds of communities really rely on forms of pride to create that sense of community in the first place. And the Christian realism, is most associated with international politics and foreign policy. Of course, most famously, the irony of American history, but it builds fundamentally on his analysis of liberal democracy in the West and the US specifically. I'll skip the part of, of how the Munich Security Conference actually has very close ties to NIBUR in many ways. It's not, there directly, but you could draw a lot of connections there. The 2023 report actually quotes the NIBUR indirectly by quoting Winston Churchill, right, and kind of saying like, okay, international order is flawed, but it's still kind of, or might be the worst, but only compared to all the others. What Churchill actually said is that, he was quoting someone else as saying that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. And, people have made the argument that he was actually referring to NIBUR. It's his famous adage in the Children of Light and the Children of Darkness, where it says, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. So for NIBUR, Western liberal democracies, this is important because that's in support of what the Security Conference report did, are indeed best equipped, right, to deal with the human condition because they balance freedom and order in the best possible way. And kind of like, integrate this idea that we are prone to falling into sin. And more specifically, he tells us in this book that this is the key point when it comes to dealing with the far right, that if we are the children of light and we are the ones who claim that we're working towards a more social, a more just world, then when we confront children of darkness, like the far right, of course, for NIBUR, that was mostly the Nazi regime in Germany, we have to get realistic about human self-interest, including self-interest of the West, both past and present, because otherwise the children of darkness will exploit that tendency towards self-interest. And what we're seeing, interestingly enough, and this is where I'll end, is that in Germany and the US, we do see that kind of like self-critical response and along Niebuhrian lines emerging. Just to give you one example, this is President Biden just earlier this year when he made this proclamation about the Emmett Till National Monument in Illinois and Mississippi. He said, we should know about our country. We should know everything, the good, the bad, the truth of who we are as a nation. That's what great nations do. And we are a great nation. We got a hell of a long way to go, right? So we need to know ourselves as good as we can, because otherwise the children of darkness will abuse that situation. And the kind of thought process I think that we have to go through is to apply that to the West, right? And this sounds very, very different. I find it, if we replace kind of the nation with the West in this quote from Biden and the community of liberal democracies, then this is, we got a long way to go. And yeah, so this is my conclusion, that we are facing a threat, but we have to define far right violence and West via each other, and NIBUR essentially helps us do that. Sorry for going over.
Fantastic. That's fantastic, Josie. I'm going to summarize this in three or four words. You can tell me if this is wrong, but it's very dangerous to idealize the West. We can come, as I say, you can tell me if that's wrong in a minute. So we slightly overrunning, but we do have 15 minutes or so for questions. I've also completely failed already in my role as a moderator because I was so excited about the subject and wanting to get going, and I totally forgot to properly introduce Josie. So let me do that very quickly now. She's a visiting research fellow at Aston University in Birmingham. She was a Dahrendorf postdoctoral fellow at the Hertie School in Berlin, and her book, Imagining Far-Right Terrorism, Violence, Migration, and the Nation State in Contemporary Western Europe, was published in 2022. Apologies, I didn't do that at the beginning, Josie. So I've got a million questions. Do ask your questions or make your comments in the Q&A box, as I suggested at the beginning. While you're doing that, I'll maybe just start. So, I mean, it was so fascinating to go back to this this kind of historical document, almost, the Munich Security Conference report from 2020, and to sort of look at it closely. And I mean, I'm just struck by how incredibly binary and simplistic this thinking is. about the West and about what's going on in international politics as well. But could you say something about how you think this concept, what it tells us about how the concept is used in Germany specifically, as opposed to, for example, the United States, right? Because this is a German think tank. And, it strikes me that, the West does have this very specific meaning in Germany, which, has to do with the role that it played in overcoming the Nazi past, right? I'm thinking here particularly the concept of the Westbindung. And so it does strike me that there's a particular way in which the West gets idealized in Germany. And then if you think about the United States, and here I'm thinking particularly of Michael Kimmage's book, The Abandonment of the West, where I think he shows very persuasively that at least until recently, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, the concept of the West was in decline in the United States, particularly in US foreign policy debates, precisely because it was seen as being so connected to the idea of whiteness. So, I mean, tell me if you agree or disagree with that, but or just any other thoughts you have on do we use the term the West in the same way in the United States and in Germany?
Short answer, no. The question, of course, is how that will then limit perhaps our ability to actually talk in a productive way about the far-right violence as a threat to the West. That's an empirical question, and I'm not aware of any research that has looked at that in detail yet. I think what is important to point out is that the West, although as a concept relates very differently to national histories, as you were just pointing out, it does relate to national identities ultimately, right? It is a question of stories of success and achievements. Of course, in the German case in particular, the idea that because Germany was kind of fighting the idea of a modern West, that culminated in the Nazi regime, right? And then it spent decades also, through that process of walking off the past, creating this Westbindung and integrating Germany into those institutions, and of course, the U.S. being the most important partner in a way, to put it in positive terms, in this endeavor. And for that reason, of course, you have these very positive ideas of the West, especially in the German context, because it is in a way a kind of a saving concept, right? Of not being German in a way, but being part of the West. And it might not always be as explicit, but you can't tell an idea of a positive German national identity without references to the West. For the US, that is very different, but at the same time, there's still, and I think that's being revived at the moment in response to that threat, an idea of yes, responsibility, exceptionalism. The question of how can you halt the relative decline of the US in the world, and so in a way, far-right violence as a threat. And while we're kind of like working through its history since 1945 in a way, brings that concept back on the agenda. And the question is, to what extent that is helpful or not. I think when we talk about Niebuhr, it actually is helpful to use his work because, of course, his thinking is very much attached to an idea of Western civilization. He talks about the West all the time. He talks about Western civilization, but in combination with his idea of his dialectics of the human condition, which integrates sinfulness, right? So I think that's an important starting point, but it will also perhaps make it easier to talk about these things in a way that is not just about like, you kind of want to abandon the West, and it's very emotional, obviously, in many ways. But ultimately, Niebuhr is, has a lot in common with the language that is actually being used in these debates, but he also brings in something else that is missing from that discussion. Yeah.
So I want to come back to Niebuhr in a minute if no one else brings him up. And there's still no questions, but so I'm just going to keep going until there are some questions in the Q&A box. I'm thinking also, when I was thinking about, the idealization of the West in Germany, I was thinking also of the sort of important work of Heinrich August Winkler, this idea of the long road west, and the phrase, you used this phrase at one point, the normative project of the West, which comes from Winkler. And then when I think more recently of, for example, the book that Thomas Kleiner Brockhoff wrote, in German, The World Needs the West, Die Welt braucht den Westen, I sort of do wonder whether I find it quite hard to imagine a book like that with a title like that being written in the United States for exactly the reasons that I mentioned. But that brings me, though, in a way to something which you've already hinted at. And this was going to be my next question. Is the other reason that it's so fascinating to go back and look at that Munich Security Conference report from 2020 is that things have changed a bit since then, right? So, this was all about Westlessness and this crisis of the West. And, since then, in particular, I think since the war in Ukraine began, there is this sense that the West is back, right? And the West is no longer in crisis. And it's very interesting to think about, what's going on there, especially because I think that sense of the West being in crisis, which was there in 2020, I think, to me, the moment, the real nadir, as it were, was the debacle of the US withdrawal from Kabul. Then there was a real sense of the kind of West, but also NATO as the sort of embodiment of the strategic project of the West, as opposed to the normative or the civilizational. That was really in crisis. But then very quickly after that, you have the Russian invasion, and this real sense that the West is back. Now, again, my impression is that the discourse in the United States is less about the West than it is in Europe, actually, and in particular in Germany. But again, maybe you could say something about your sense of how things have changed since 2020 in terms of this. You've talked about the far right and how they're embracing the concept of the West. But do you have any sense of what's going on with, more sort of mainstream, particularly in foreign policy discourse, what's happening there in the concept of the West in, Germany and the United States?
Yeah, I mean, what the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and February 22 certainly has done, it is interesting enough not only to bring the concept of the West back, and the 22 report actually talks about helplessness, right, and unlearning helplessness, mostly focused on Ukraine, right, to say, like, Ukraine has taught us how not to be helpless, right, how to defend independence, sovereignty against an authoritarian regime. That is very, very palpable there. I'm in no position to comment on the war itself or whatever Ukraine is doing or not doing, but the point is that we do have this parallel development of like a reinvigoration of the West, and Ukraine is a kind of like leader in a way, to show the rest of the Western world how it's done, right? It's a country at war trying to defend itself, and at the same time, part of all of this is the far right network, right? Is Ukrainian far right, a country that, like any other in Europe, of course, has a far right scene, and a very strong one at that. I mean, the 2020 report itself mentions Ukraine twice on those 2 pages. Just a special section on right-wing extremism. It does mention that Kiev is a hub for the far right scene in Europe. It does mention the Azov battalion as the a kind of key actor within those networks. And so I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with the war, but even when it ends, these things will still be there, right? And so you have these parallel narratives of a strong far right that needs to be resisted, but that is also part of essentially the nationalist effort against Russia, right? And at the same time, you have this very powerful narrative of Ukraine and the West, which of course is also promoted by Ukrainian leaders themselves. And all of that might be happening for very good reason, but ultimately that will kind of come back. It will come back on the agenda, and we have to go sort it out, right? There's this relationship then between the West and the far right, and also Eastern Europe, ideas of Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, which in itself, at least within academia, is one of those areas that is still less researched overall, or at least research that is less visible overall in the academic community. The far right in the that part of Europe. But again, there's a lot of things are happening there as well. It's very dynamic. There's a lot of very good research recently that has come out on these questions. But those will be political questions, how to talk about this. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, we're talking about very, very recent developments, but that will keep us, busy for years to come.
Yeah. That's fascinating that the 2020 Munich Security Conference report mentions the far right in Ukraine, in particular the Azov battalion.
The 2020, yeah, so the same.
2021, yeah, which slightly confirms my impression, certainly in the UK. I won't speak for Germany or the US, that this was stuff which was being talked about until February 2022, but since then it's been very difficult to talk about this because this is perceived as sort of playing into Putin's narratives and so on about
I mean, politically that's fairly easy to understand in a way, but it's interesting to look at very good academic research that does come out on Ukraine and the far right in Ukraine, which is separate from all these political issues. There's important historical work being done, and we see right now just how important that research is to inform political debate at a moment of that is very much about characterized debates.
It seems as if the Q&A is not working, Eric tells me. So if you want to use the chat box instead to ask a question, then do that. Eric also asks a question himself, which maybe you can answer, Josie, about the right-wing, how the one right-wing extremism index cited Germany with the most such potential. That sort of also, I guess, slightly brings up something else which has happened relatively recently, which is the AfD in Germany now becoming the second most popular party in a way that I think surprised quite a lot of people. And Jack Janes also, I think, has a question. No. Do you want to answer that one in the meantime, Josie, and then I'll come to the next one?
Yeah, so I mean, the index asks about perceptions, right, of threats, and because Germany has seen quite a lot of major attacks over the past few years, that probably explains why it is the country, at least, well, probably out of the 12, but certainly out of those 6, North America and Western Europe, we know where perceptions are most intense when it comes to right-wing terrorism. How that is related to AfD specifically, I wouldn't be able to say. Again, that relation between violence and far-right parties is still very much on the research agenda. But of course, I mean, it kind of adds to the overall impression of losing control, of there being very little that you can do against these developments, and we see in Germany right now how that actually provokes greater mainstreaming of far right ideas.
Okay, so inevitably now there are a bunch of questions, and we've only got a couple of minutes left. Let's maybe overrun for a few minutes, but I won't overrun that long. But let's maybe take the 2 questions that we have, and I'll sort of throw another one in as part of one of them. So maybe we could. So there's a question from Carol about Western civilization and whether it's a good idea, whether it's a European thing, or is it potentially universal for all races and regions. If we think of it as European, don't we buy into it being a white Christian identity? So this opens up a whole new sort of set of questions around European civilizationalism, which is something I've been working on, as opposed to sort of Western civilizationalism, although they're obviously quite closely connected. But maybe also, Josie, maybe you could just sort of say a little bit more about these these different definitions of the West. And if I've understood you correctly, are you saying, which would certainly, I think, be my view, that it's really difficult actually to separate out, these different visions of what the West is? So the Munich Security Conference report wants to do this in a very simple way. As you said, there's kind of a good West and a bad West, right? And the bad West is a kind of perversion of the real West, is the implication of the way they frame it. But it seems to me that all these things in the history of the West go together. The civilizational version, the normative version, the strategic version. So, for example, if you look at the North Atlantic Treaty, the foundational document of the strategic idea of the West, it includes the idea of Western civilization, right? This was there from the beginning. So, I think my sense would be that it's impossible to kind of extract in a way, the sort of good West from these other ideas of the West. Is that your sense too, or did I misunderstand you?
Yes, I think it's difficult to separate them. I mean, from a Niebuhrian perspective, that is what we would expect in a way, because, the positive and the negative, to put it, kind of crudely, are in a dialectical relationship with each other, right? All the things that are good about how we think of the world and the ways in which we strive towards more justice, etc. Is always in some ways linked with sin and evil. And the question is, I think at this stage, it's really about greater awareness of that being the case. I mean, I think that question about Western civilization as a good thing for the world really speaks to what Niebuhr, more towards the end of his career, was writing about. And actually, this is the last chapter in the Children of Light and Children of Darkness, where he writes about world community, where he writes about how difficult it is to expand this process of working towards a more just world beyond the nation in particular, because there's this problem of self-interest only grows, right? But he does talk about universalism. He talk from a Christian perspective. He does talk about values of democracy and balancing order and freedom, really speaking to the human condition in the most ethical way, as something that is indeed desirable for the entire world. The question is how we get there, and how we or the fact that we can only get there if we become more realistic, as it were, about the human condition, right? Rather than being too idealistic, too naive about ourselves. So indeed, to the extent that this idea of Western civilization is tied to very concrete ideas of how to organize human communities, that is indeed something that is worth pursuing, definitely from Niebuhr's perspective, for the entire world.
So is he basically saying that we need to be more sort of humble and self-critical?
Humble and self-critical without losing sight of the goal, as it were, right? So sometimes, I mean, the reception of his Christian realism stops at that level of we have to be humble in terms of how much we can achieve, and then also quite often it is not tied to this idea of self-criticism as much. That was really, I think, an issue with talking about Obama's love for Niebuhr, where this the self-critical aspect, at least from foreign policy, was missing a bit.
Sometimes you do get this idea also that which ends up kind of bringing you back full circle, which is we in the West are more uniquely able to be self-critical than anyone else is, right? So it ends up being another form of kind of Western superiority in a way. But I think you've now answered Katja Albrecht's question, which was, do you have a vision for where we might land after working through the redefinitions you have suggested? And so maybe we'll end with Jack Jane's question, which I'll just read out. Isn't the ultimate question one that poses it as, who is the we when we say the West? And then he quotes, I think, Niebuhr, as individuals, we are trying to establish justice between each other, but as racial, economic, and national groups, they take whatever power they command. Perhaps you recognize that quote, Josie.
Yes.
Can you explain that to us? Is that the ultimate question?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that is, most of his work revolves around these different levels of community organization, right? I mean, he starts out really with in 1932 in Moral Man and Immoral Society, where his key argument is that, you know, individuals are capable of being moral, right? But it gets infinitely more complicated when we talk about community. Kind of, you know, immoral community. So communities are, in a way, naturally more immoral than individuals. He revises that later on to say that, well, actually individuals are just as immoral, but he never really revises his, you know, idea of immoral community. On the contrary, right? So he spends another 30, almost 40 years really writing about how we can deal with the fact that communities, imagined communities in particular, right, starting with a nation and beyond, how we can work towards a more just world in spite of ourselves, in a way, right? And he does write quite a bit about the United Nations and as a you know, potential way of organizing this, but he does say that the sense of community comes before governance. So in other words, you know, in this context, that would mean that we have to create this different idea, more critical, more like a fuller picture, as it were, of the West, in order to then kind of face threats that do concern not just the West, but the world community, really. I think it's a very important point. It's a very interesting speech by Jacinda Ardern, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, just a few months before the UN, actually, just a few months after the Christchurch attack, where she says, you know, I mean, as these networks grow worldwide, and they have all these different connections, on the political level, we also have to develop a greater sense of, like, we have to take care of all of humanity, right? Because you have, you know, these very, very complex, complicated societies now where you can't distinguish neatly anymore between us and them. And so indeed, the question of, like, who is we and how do we, you know, reorganize this in terms of institutions, accountability, responsibility, on the UN level is indeed the key question. But I think to end on a hopeful note, I think we're moving that direction, and the question is how to deal with the backlash against that we're seeing across the West right now.
Great. I mean, I think that's a good place to end, since that was the ultimate question, as you confirmed. This is, I think this has been fantastic. I'm really looking forward to the paper or the book that's going to come out of this. I think this kind of combination of the far right and the West and Niebuhr is a really interesting kind of way of thinking about the far right. Thank you very much, Josie. Thank you for those of you who have asked questions and stayed with us until the end. I'm just going to hand over to Eric for some closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Hans, and thank you, Josie. That was just a tremendous presentation, and we're all looking forward to the paper, which of course will be available on the AGI website, as well as distributed through our weekly advisor newsletter, which I hope all the attendees look forward to every week. So thank you one more time. Thank you to all the attendees for participating today, and please look forward to our next events. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.